Hey guys, so I'm doing a bit of a forward on this video before we get into the beginning of this. And the reason I'm doing this is because a lot of the information talked about in here can be sensitive to some people, and there's some warnings you'll see after this recording. But one of the reasons that I'm doing this is my Arma 3 group has just started doing a Ukrainian war fighting against Russia. And since that's a super hot topic right now, I figured one of the things I would do is actually give you guys information, resources, and do a little bit of a podcast with one of our teammates on Arma 3 that's called Fisher. So just kind of putting this at the front. And if you guys hear any information and you want more info, feel free to hit me up in the comments. I will talk with Fisher and see what else I can get for you guys. If you guys learn something awesome, or if you guys have more knowledge that Fisher and I didn't cover, then go ahead and post it in the comments, and I will do up some more research and see what else I can find. Otherwise, I hope you enjoy.
Warning. This podcast shows contested views, and may trigger some people. The things discussed in this podcast are sensitive in nature but are meant for educational purposes. Please do your own research before making any final opinions. This is your final warning. The things discussed in this podcast are sensitive in nature. Enjoy the podcast.
Alright, you'll have to excuse me. Obviously I've taken some stuff out, and word being word is not like when you have images. There's a little something for you. That was a Belarus essay I did.
Okay.
The interesting part of that, there's a little bit throughout there about the history of the area as a whole. But the most important part in relation to Ukraine for that is you're looking at sort of part of the historical overview near the bottom, and then you're also looking at the current affairs towards the bottom and the looking forward bit. You'll also notice that there is a bibliography in there if you want to go have a look further. I'm going to send you this as well, because this is quite cool. This is what I've just been watching. Yeah. So, obviously, I lived in a house. To give you a bit of background, when the whole thing kicked off, I was living in a house with one of my best mates who was in the same class as me, Eastern European class. So I woke up in the morning, went downstairs, and the invasion kicked off at 5 o'clock in the morning, local time, on the Thursday. I came downstairs at about 8, 9 o'clock. We had class, and came downstairs. My mate Harry was also getting ready to come to class with me, and sort of got downstairs and had a look at my phone and was having my breakfast. And he comes out of his room and he goes, "You seen the news?" And I go, "Yeah, I've seen the news." And he said, "Did we think this was going to happen?" And I was like, "Thought it might. Thought today was going to be the day that they were going to do it, and just kind of hoped they didn't." And he goes, "Yeah, are we kind of fucked?" And I went, "Yeah, slightly."
Oh boy.
Yeah. I don't know. You remember Herzog, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. So Hertz and I were talking quite a lot that week, and one of the conversations that we had together, I don't remember who else was in the channel, but see, Hertz is quite a smart guy. He's got his fingers in quite a few pies, um, and we were having this conversation. Obviously, he comes from a more military background on the subject, and I came from a more political background. And I believe it was we came up with. I think we were talking on the Monday, and we said that if they were gonna invade Ukraine, it would be across one of 3 days, but we figured that the one day which they would most probably do it was the Thursday. And that was the theory we came up with, and it was sort of bittersweet when that Thursday rolled around and we woke up, and one of the first things I did was send Hertz a message. Let me see if I can find it. It was November, so we're further up than that. I um, that's March. That's March. That's March. Oh, I can't see. But yeah, we had a sit down and basically went, "Oh fuck, we were right." And one of the reasons why we thought about the day that it was because in February, um, on February the 20th, there was the Munich Security Council, and the US was holding meetings. I think it was the day before Ukraine, and we figured that they wouldn't do it before or during the Munich Security Council. It's not particularly a good idea to invade a country that is pretty chummy with all of the people that are currently sat at a security conference.
Right.
Because you give them a pretty good idea of, well, first off, they're all in the same place. They can all come up with a strategy on what to do now. And the US, after the security conference, was having meetings. And they, I think it was the 23rd, they had a meeting. And that was the last one with Blinken before he went home. And we thought that if they were going to do it, they were probably going to do it after Blinken's meeting. Because otherwise, he's still in Europe and he's still pottering around and he can still, create a coordinated response as early as possible. And so that's when they did it. So that gives you a little bit of background on what the thinking was going into it, and the thinking as soon as it happens. If you want, I can start answering your questions more in depth if you are ready for me to do so.
I was just gonna start reading questions out to you whenever I thought it was appropriate, but you go
Go
on
for it.
fucking montage, man. I fucking love this. This is the info of somebody who is significantly closer to a war of this scale because the US has been in a war for 20 years, right?
Yeah,
We've grown used to oh, these soldiers haven't come home because fucking ISIS or Al Qaeda or whatever the threat was at that moment decided to plant an IED and we lost good men. Is it sad? Yes, but
yeah,
unfortunately the US populace has become so accustomed to that it's no longer as massive an effect as it used to be. If you go back couple years just back into the Korean War, into Vietnam. When we lost people, we lost them and we were pissed that we lost them. And so we would up our forces and we continued to make bigger and bigger forces trying to overwhelm these people.
Yeah.
And that's not what the US does anymore. And so with us having that disconnect and being so far away from something, because for us, mind you, this is on a complete other side of an ocean, halfway across the world. It
Hmm.
does not directly affect us, other than
No.
maybe we're spending a little bit extra money for sending you guys ammo or tanks or whatever.
Mm.
So having the story of somebody who's closer to it and seeing all the things around you that is affected uh is a different story, is a different ball game. And that's kind of what I want people to get out of this when this video comes out, is to see the major difference in the way of thinking of people.
Let me give you a quick little analogy for that, because I think that's a really good point. Um, a lot of people in the US don't understand. Obviously, this is not. It's, I'm going to call it an incident for now. This incident is not isolated to the borders within Ukraine, or even Russia, right? Um, Before February last year, at the house that I'm currently in right now, our gas and electric costs day to day were probably sub $8, right? So about £6, £6 a day to run gas and electricity. Um, Now, fast forward a year, obviously we've just finished February. I actually had this conversation with a friend a couple of days ago about his gas and electric bill. We're paying, I want to say about 14, £15 a day, which is approximately 17, $18 a day for gas and electric. So you're talking uh, over 100% increase in the price of what we're paying for that. So, we're paying what, a couple on, I want to say, don't quote me on the maths here. I was never very good at maths, so I want to say somewhere ballpark between, you're talking $500 to $700 a month on gas and electric. My friend just down the road, he was saying the other day that he's spending approximately a month £1,500 on his gas and electric, which is more akin to about $1,800 a month just on gas and electricity. So the price of that has really gone sky high.
Yeah, so it is more than 100% increase
Yeah,
in 1 year's time.
which is unheard of. Apart from in the US, obviously you had the oil crises in the 70s. You had two. Obviously, the price of gasoline went up pretty high. But you guys typically don't have that now. You have pretty good. Yes, you import from Canada and Mexico a lot of your energy, or some of your energy, but for the most part, you're pretty secure in that. Um, since then, you guys have been stockpiling all of your energy inputs. We don't have that. We don't have the infrastructure for that, and almost every single European nation was hit pretty badly at the beginning of the Ukraine war. Germany, especially. You're talking about 40% of Germany's natural gas came from Russia. It's the reason why Germany was so hesitant about sending supplies to Ukraine is because they use that natural gas not just for energy, but they also use that as a primary input in their manufacturing. Um, and that was what their economy was based off of. Now, for every 2% that the price in natural gas changed in Germany, you were looking at a roughly 60% increase in price. They lost 40% of their inputs. And the Nord Stream pipeline, which supplied Germany, which went roughly from Leningrad to northern Germany, that's been blown up. We don't know who it's been blown up by, but that pipeline will never be able to be used again. They've done a good job at getting their natural gas in from other places. It's still more expensive than it used to be. They still haven't got enough of it. I think they're paying about 7 times as much now for that gas.
Jesus.
But they've got it. So everyone in Europe has sort of got themselves together and found the things that they need. But that's why, in the UK right now, we're talking about a cost of living crisis. People attribute the cost of living crisis in the UK to many different things. Brexit, one of them. I think Brexit plays a part, but I think one of the larger parts that it plays into is probably the war in Ukraine, where we've now been cut off from the world's largest supplier of fertilizer, which is Russia. We've also been cut off from the world's largest exporters of grain, primary agriculture. So you're talking Russia was the top. Ukraine was the 5th exporter of stuff like wheat, corn, etc. That's been cut off. A lot of natural resources have been cut off, like bauxite. Obviously, bauxite primarily comes from the 2 big ones, where we can get it anywhere typically, but for us, the 2 big ones are Australia and Ireland, who used to then send their bauxite to Russia and Ukraine to be developed into aluminium. Right, bauxite's a primary ingredient in aluminium. That's been cut off. So we're struggling. Neon, most of the neon comes from Russia and Ukraine. You need neon for microchips. That's another one of the reasons why we're seeing a microchip shortage. So cost-wise, we are really kind of screwed, to put it mildly, where we're now having to find substitutes for all the things that we used to be able to get just on the other side of the continent. Now we're looking at places like Africa, Asia, South America. That's going to require a hell of a lot of investment to get those things up and running. We're already seeing investment put into there, but then you got to remember, not only do we have to get it up and running, we've then got to start extracting it, and then we've got to then start producing what those materials make. So things are going to be expensive for a while in Europe. But it has, in the US, it has its benefits. It'll probably make you guys a lot more self-sufficient and competitive on the things that you need to make yourself self-sufficient. But in Europe, right now we're a little screwed. But talking more physically about the war, about how people have been infected, sorry. When the war first kicked off, and you might have read this, I put it in, there was a general feeling of, oh fuck, in a lot of Europe. Not so much that you guys would have had in the US. Now, you're always going to have your TikTok kids who are like, this is literally the beginning of World War III. The amount of TikToks I saw about how people were going to get drafted and how World War III was starting, probably as a joke, some of them maybe not, was quite a lot. But in Europe, there was a genuine sense of like, this could be bad. And for instance, the first day of that this war kicked off, I have family in Poland, as you may know, and I called them up.
Still with me?
I said, hey, how are you guys? They're packed to go back. Yo, yeah, hi, sorry, did I?
Yeah, you cut out there, so I want to make sure you were still with me.
Oh, no, you're good. Yeah, so I called up my family in Poland on that first day of the war and sort of just asked them, how are you doing? What's going on? How are you feeling? They said, not feeling great. They remember communism pretty well. It's a hard thing to forget being oppressed for that long. and they had packed go bags. They had gone to fill their cars full of fuel, just in case they got the news that this wasn't stopping in Ukraine. They were booking it west. And from the people that I've talked to since, that was a pretty generalized feeling was the oh fuck, we could be next feeling. That was the first day of the war. We're talking, a couple of days and of all right, Ukraine is about to fall. Ukraine's about to fall. My big oh shit moment where I was like, this is it, right? Ukraine is no longer a sovereign state in the next couple of hours. Was do you remember the Battle of Hostomel Airport in the first couple of days of the war?
I remember it roughly. I know that there was a lot of news coverage on it on the
Yeah,
US side of things. And at the time I was brand new again to TikTok. I had deleted that app years ago and I had
yeah,
just come back to it probably in December or January, right before the
hmm
kickoff of the war. And suddenly there was just a flood of info. And I thought it
yeah,
was it was interesting coming from independent news sources, people who have family over there or people who were over there, and they were giving the info to us the best that they can through TikTok. And
yeah,
you could see the difference in the news between the American publicized oh Jesus words public news of like CNN, Fox News, NBC, things like that, and people who were actually on the ground who were closer.
yeah. Well, it's often said that Vietnam was like the first televised war, right? I would like to extend that one further and say that Ukraine was probably the first internet war where we could go online. I remember that first day we'd be looking at a website called Live UA Map, and you could pinpoint exactly when and where things were happening, videos of things getting shot down. The reason why I mention Hostomel Airport specifically is because a lot of that early footage of helicopters buzzing around Ukraine, um, things getting shot down, a lot of the combat footage was primarily around Kiev and focused in the north on Hostomel Airport. Hostomel Airport was a airfield about 20 minutes outside of Kiev to the north. Um, and in the beginning hours of the war, this was the key target, the number one target that Russia needed to take. And they paratrooped a bunch of VDV divisions, airborne division, a bunch of VDV troops, their airborne division, onto Hostomel Airport. They landed a lot of guys there, and they they managed to capture it. The Ukrainians had anti-air up; they were shooting things down, but they weren't able to stop them from taking it. And I remember the oh fuck moment in my head was I was watching the news, and there was some footage that was put up of a CNN reporter at Hostomel Airport going up to what he thought was a Ukrainian officer at the airport, and he goes up to them and he asks, who are you? How are things getting on? And the guy responds and says, "Oh, I'm not Ukrainian, I'm Russian." And the fact that CNN even managed to get it so wrong and didn't realize that this guy was Russian and not Ukrainian really made me think like, okay, this is not a good sign.
Right.
The moment where I realized Kiev might be okay, on the flip side of that, was started getting a lot of videos coming out, especially from reporters in the middle of Kiev, Because bear in mind, there were a lot of reporters in Kiev at the beginning because they were reporting on what they saw as tensions in Ukraine, but no one genuinely thought it was going to kick off until the BBC were live broadcasting when the first Russian missiles hit Kiev, and in the middle of the broadcast they had to put flak jackets on. So there were a lot of reporters in Kiev, and they were interviewing lots of people. Almost every single civilian that they were talking to either had an AK, was making Molotov cocktails, was setting up a defensive position. Everyone. Then it comes out that some officers had managed to bring together a large part of the National Guard, and also a Ukrainian SF group had started moving around Kiev. And then they started shelling the airfield and took the airfield because the VDV ran out of supplies. And at that point, Kiev was basically secure. They couldn't land anyone. They couldn't land any supplies. They were completely cut off, and there was just no way for them to push forward. The main focus then shifted to the 40-mile convoy that was heading down from Belarus. We thought it was a convoy. Turns out it was more of a traffic jam.
I do remember hearing about that. They ran out of fuel on their way there.
Well, the primary issue was this 40-kilometer convoy got stopped by resistance, right? So then you had a bit of a bottleneck because everyone decided to take the same road. All of these brigades and divisions were all on the same road, trying to get to the same objective, because you can't cut through, as you'll see in the document I just sent you, the border between Ukraine and Belarus is extremely marshy, right? So you can only take the roads. And so they had all picked the same roads to go down and ended up creating this convoy of 40 kilometers. Started facing some resistance. So the convoy stopped on the road because they couldn't go onto the fields because it's marshland. So then they're sitting there idle for, 4 days, and they run out of fuel. And then, because they forgot to bring fuel, and after 7 days, they realised that they forgot to bring food. An army can't march on an empty stomach, and they also can't drive back to Belarus. So all of the infantry got out of their vehicles and started walking back to Belarus. At which point, the battle for Kiev was basically done. There was still some worries in the east about encirclements down towards the Donetsk sort of region. It looked like there was going to be a very large cauldron forming. That never materialized. The Ukrainians were able to stabilize their fronts pretty well. And for the most part, they were able to hold them in pretty good positions. I mean, the Russians were only able to cross the Dnieper in one area. They could only cross over by Kherson, and the Ukrainians managed to hold them there. They couldn't get any further. In the north, they couldn't get any further than Kharkiv. And the lines that the Ukrainians were sitting in the Donbass had been there since 2014. So they were pretty heavily entrenched, and it was going to take a lot of power to move through those entrenched lines. And Russians didn't really have that. That's why they went up through Crimea and went across their borders around it. And it didn't work out as great as they thought. Going back to 2014, where just talking about those entrenched lines. 2014, obviously, we had we had a couple of big events. We had the annexation of Crimea. That was a big blow for the Ukrainians. They basically gave it up without any resistance. Since 2014, the Russians, they gave it up in basically a month. The Russians, as soon as they captured that, started funneling money into two key areas. The first one was infrastructure. So they built the Kerch Strait Bridge, which connected Russia to Crimea. Um, Before that, all there existed was a ferry, and it wasn't a very good one. So they now had a physical connection to Crimea. The other thing that they started to do was build up the military infrastructure of Crimea. Crimea has always been a very strategic target in the Black Sea. Um, Even the British have fought over Crimea um, in the 19th century, which should give you a pretty good idea of how important the world sees that location. Um, the Russians had it; they started investing into it. Um, the only weakness of Crimea is fresh water supply. Do you know where the fresh water for Crimea comes from?
I do not know.
So the fresh water from Crimea comes from the Dnieper River, which runs straight through the middle of Ukraine. There is a little siphon that comes off it near Kherson, and that canal goes all the way down through Ukraine into Crimea. Obviously, the Ukrainians had just lost Crimea, and they weren't exactly a fan of the Russians having it. So they decided to cut off the water. Don't quote me on this, but I believe they managed to broker a deal and get the water back on. I don't understand how the Russians would be able to keep Crimea going without that fresh water supply. Obviously, that was one of the big military goals for Russia in this war, was taking that fresh water siphon. They had it for a while. Now it's contested. That was the first thing that happened, and that was the start of it in 2014. 2016 rolls around, and the eastern side of Ukraine has always had closer Russian links naturally than the West. As a result, you had hyper-partisanized members of the Donbass area who saw an opportunity to break away from Ukraine and rejoin Russia. They did this. Initially, they were pretty successful with a lot of Russian military equipment. Either that had been left over and they had managed to get from Ukraine itself, and some that was given by Russia. The the Donetsk People's Republic and the Luhansk People's Republic, whatever the actual names of those are, please forgive me, I can't remember off the top of my head. We're doing pretty okay, and then they weren't. And Russia didn't like the fact that they weren't doing so well, and decided to put in the Little Green Men, as they were called in the media. This was men in Russian-looking uniforms without any insignias,
Yes.
so they couldn't be traced back.
So this is where I came into this. So this would have been 2016, 2017, correct?
Yeah,
So during this time, I had a young gentleman that came over to the US with his family that was uh they were coming over, they were spending time here in the US, and they had actually joined my search and rescue team. And so he
right.
was doing search and rescue with me, and we had all sorts of questions about Ukraine because at the time, that's when these little green men, using the media term, uh,
Yeah,
had started rolling into Russia. Sorry, my mistake. Uh, Rolling into Ukraine and being there. And I remember his stories about waking up and there's these Russian uniforms with black baklavas on, and they're just walking down the street, uncontested.
yeah. And that was a bit weird, to put it mildly. Is you had these guys coming in, and they were very effective. I mean, 2016 to 2017 is when you had a lot of the big conflict happening in the Donbass. To give you a bit of context, Ukraine is most famous for their agriculture output, right? The Donbass was the industrial output of Ukraine primarily, right? So that's where you had most of the primary industrialization within Ukraine. So it's a pretty important area. And you have these little green men coming in, and the Ukrainian army just was not able to hold them back. They were very helpful for the Donetsk and Luhansk armies in pushing out a little bit further and securing that territory, because the fighting in that area was not conventional. It was a lot more fluid, right? A lot of the big cities, obviously, you had fighters in with pretty much secured areas, but it was not it was not like a frontline war up until the point that the little green men started coming in, and they basically pushed Ukraine to the edge of Donetsk, not the Donbass region, just to the edge of Donetsk, and managed to solidify that line. That's when you then had brokers coming in for peace, and you had a peace treaty or a ceasefire signed. It was a very tenuous deal. The Ukrainians were not necessarily willing to give over this great industrial area, and obviously the people on the other side weren't exactly thrilled with being controlled by Ukraine for whatever reason. So you still had both sides shelling each other intermittently, even though they weren't officially supposed to be fighting. The biggest issue for a lot of the guys on the ground was not just the artillery, but also that every single building on both sides basically had a long rifle in, constantly aimed outwards. Sticking your head up was basically a death sentence in these areas. So you had a lot of people on both sides who were digging very deep trenches, so you didn't have to stick your heads up, and were also building defenses that wouldn't allow vehicles or any heavy equipment through to your lines. That's why Russia wasn't able to push that far out of, for instance, fighting near Donetsk is still going on. If you have a look at the maps of fighting in Ukraine, you're talking in some places of the front line, less than 20 kilometers distance from Donetsk. So the front line really hasn't shifted that much there, even within a year of large-scale fighting.
Well, essentially, they turned it into a World War I trench system.
Yeah.
Heavy fortifications on the top, deep trenches for moving around, so you don't actually have to stand up, and it's a stalemate on that side.
Exactly, yeah. And the chances of that changing anytime soon are next to none. The interesting part about this, obviously, is the history, right? So we've just talked about from 2014 forwards. If you go back from that, and you go a long way back, you're talking to the Middle Ages, right? The primary people in that area were the people called the Kievan Rus. Many people have held claim over the Ukrainian land over the course of thousands of years. One of those was the Mongols. The Mongols were not stopped until they reached Poland, basically. But before the Mongols, you had the Kievan Rus. And you might hear the last part of that and associate it with two different nations, Belarus and Russia, right? In Russian, Russia is Russia, I believe. Again, don't quote me on that. I think I've got that right. But that comes from the Rus people. The Kievan Rus were one of the prominent Rus people in the area, obviously from Kiev. You also have Belarus, which is literally translates as White Rus, not White Russia, as most people see it. And then Russia itself is just land of the Rus, right? So all of these places historically are quite heavily interlinked. They've always had some sort of connection or another. Primarily, the main religion has always been Orthodox Christianity. So the churches all aligned. Up until recently in Ukraine, that was the same case. The Ukrainian Orthodox Church has broken away from the Russian Orthodox Church. But they were aligned not just in their heritage, but also in their religion. And they had quite a large cultural and social connection as well. The Ukraine was seen going forward in the USSR as one of the most important territories. You had several leaders of the USSR came from Ukraine. I believe Khrushchev was from Ukraine, which should tell you just about as much as you need to know. Khrushchev was one of the most influential leaders of the Soviet Union. Obviously, you had a lot of big power plants in Ukraine, Chernobyl being one of those. Everyone knows Chernobyl. But Ukraine was primarily seen as the breadbasket of the Soviet Union. Now, under the Soviet Union, they may have been held in decently high regard, but the Ukrainians were not a fan of the Soviets. Not many people know about this, but Stalin practically genocided the Ukrainians in the 30s in an event called the Holodomor, I believe it's called, where forced collectivization killed more people than the Holocaust in Ukraine. And those were primarily Ukrainian peasants. They died of starvation.
Jesus, okay.
Their land was seized and redistributed along the lines of communism in the eyes of making the farms more productive. What it did was cause a famine for about 6 years. And it took a hell of a long time for the population of Ukraine to recover.
Well, yeah, because you gave a fucking electrician farmland and told him to make potatoes.
Yeah, it doesn't work. Unfortunately, no one realized it didn't work and kept going with it. I forget his name, but Stalin had a scientist he employed as an advisor who believed a lot of very weird things about horticulture and agriculture. And it was directly from listening to this man that a lot of these massive issues were caused. I will find out his name and give it to you. It's very interesting. It's all pseudoscience. Basically, none of what he said was true, scientifically speaking. Yet his policies were put into place, and it starved the entire nation of Ukraine.
There's a
So
joke
clearly,
here about Fauci, but okay.
somewhere, I'll let you find that one. Best.
The angry American in me is just screaming Fauci in my brain, which is probably not great, but it works.
Oh God, but yeah. So some interesting practices were put into place in Ukraine, and it killed a hell of a lot of them, and they were all the peasant class primarily. Fast forward a couple of years, you've got World War II. Most of the Ukrainian cities are either flattened or the populations are completely devastated. I mean, you had a lot of Russians who were encircled in Kiev. I think it was about 500,000 Russian soldiers were encircled in Kiev and were told to fight down to the last bullet. Clearly, that's not going to have a good impact on the state of a city in terms of buildings still standing.
Right.
So Ukraine was pretty devastated. They had been through a agricultural genocide and starvation. Then the Germans invaded and basically shelled everything, and raped and pillaged their way through to get supplies so they could keep moving because the German logistics columns weren't great. And then the war flipped. And sorry, give me 2 seconds.
Yep. So I don't know if the recording caught this, but the reason he is currently stepping out is he is dealing with a work phone call. So I will cut this part after this, and when he comes back, it will continue.
Okay, perfect. That was short. Sorry, I'm back.
That was significantly faster than I thought it was gonna be. Okay, I even wrote like a whole thing. I explained why, and I was cutting out the audio and shit like that. That was hilarious. All right, maybe I won't cut that out, and I'll just leave it.
Hey, what can I say? My business is all about efficiency.
There you go.
So sorry, yeah. So eventually, the front lines in the war started. The Germans encountered a bit of resistance, and then they were forced backwards, back the way they came. And the Russians, when they were retreating, decided not to give the Germans anything that they could use and burnt everything to the ground. And the Germans decided, when they were retreating, to also implement a scorched earth policy and burnt everything to the ground as they retreated.
So
Significant amount. Go on.
both sides of the fucking axis then just burnt everything, scorched earth, and retreated.
Yeah. So there was very little left standing in Ukraine after the war. Plus, obviously, the Soviets threw the most amount of men into the war, and as a result, had significantly greater casualties than everyone else combined. And so you had a bit of a population problem in the entire Soviet Union afterwards. The war was pretty devastating. Now, Ukraine built back, and there was a lot of money put in by the Soviets into Ukraine, or at least as much as they could under communism to build it back. And Ukraine was not a bad place to live. Used to have Black Sea resorts on the Crimea. Crimea was given to Ukraine in 1954 by Russia, by the Russian Socialist State, I believe. Obviously, they had still the Russian Black Sea Fleet was based in Crimea, but that wasn't an issue because they were aligned together. The relationship was pretty good as it could have been. It helped that Khrushchev was Ukrainian and was leading the Soviet Union. Then we have an issue. We have a good period, and then 1989 rolls around. 1989 was not a great time for Ukraine. There was a pretty big incident that happened in Ukraine. 1986. My mistake. 1986. There was a pretty big incident that happened in Ukraine. Do you know what that incident might have been?
The only one that comes to mind is Chernobyl, and I don't believe it was Chernobyl.
Yeah.
Was it? Okay.
Yeah, Chernobyl. You're bang on there. Chernobyl rolls around. Initially, I've seen the news article for this. In the state papers, it was maybe a side note. You're talking a paragraph at most in the state paper saying that there was an incident at the Chernobyl power plant. Obviously, with the power of hindsight, we know that it was a little bit more than an incident. It was a nuclear reactor that blew up. It took the state 12 days to admit it. And that was a problem. In Ukraine, they were celebrating something called May Day, and Chernobyl's not that far from Kiev. It's north, I think it's about 30, maybe a bit more. It's not that far of a drive away. And the population of Kiev, almost in their entirety, because they had the day off of work, not that anyone went to work in communism anyway, but almost the entire city was out in the streets just after the Chernobyl accident. That's a problem, because when a nuclear reactor blows up, you get a lot of radioactive material being spewed up in the air, and that can take some time to come back down. Just so happened that it was coming down while everyone was in the streets.
Yup, perfect fucking timing. That's awesome.
Yeah. There's another level to that as well. When to counter-react the effects of radiation poisoning, you take iodine tablets. The Soviets weren't exactly known for their medical prowess, but they did have a certain amount of iodine tablets in supply. Not enough for everyone, but they did have some. The only people that were told to take iodine tablets was the senior figures of the Communist Party. So the families of these senior figures and these figures were out celebrating May Day as well. But for the most part, they were pretty unaffected because they had all been issued iodine tablets. No one else had been told or was issued them as to not cause panic. So a lot of the population was hit by a pretty healthy dosage of radiation. So it took 12 days.
It's just curing cancer. We're fine.
Yeah. It's not that big of a deal. Or at least it wasn't until Gorbachev realized that there was now a massive radioactive cloud, not only going over Ukraine and Belarus and all of his states that he basically had under his control, the Baltic states, Poland, Hungary, Czechoslovakia, but was also moving west over Western Europe as well. To give you an example of how far it went, in 1986, there were crops in England in a place called Norfolk, which is just on the coast, the east coast of England. We had to scratch the harvest there, a decent amount of harvest in England, because it was all contaminated with radioactive dust from Chernobyl.
Jeez, okay.
The other side of Europe. So the Ukrainians weren't exactly happy when Gorbachev got on TV 12 days later and said, this event in Chernobyl is a lot bigger than we thought it to be, which came as no surprise to the West, because the US had detected this through, well, it's actually the Swedish that saw it first, and had let everyone know that, hey, something's happened. Came as no surprise to the West. It did to the people in the Soviet blocs, and it came even more of a surprise to learn that it happened 12 days ago, because Russia was just going through this period of glasnost and perestroika. This was Gorbachev's two big pushes. It was a push for openness, and so to open up the economy a little bit more, allow some private enterprise, but also it was a policy of letting people criticize the government and the government being honest with the people. It took them 12 days to tell the people that you guys might be a little fucked, you might all have cancer. People weren't exactly happy about that. The Ukrainians were the top of the list. Other than all the other issues with communism during this time, which was food shortages, lack of consumer goods. People would literally queue up for hours at a store that was empty just because they heard that there was a delivery coming in. Sometimes there would be nothing and you just wasted half a day queuing. Sometimes there would be something. Usually if there was something, it would be one type of thing. For instance, my family in Poland, when they went there, queued up for a day, and you're talking about a line of a couple hours long just to get something. And it ended up being a toilet paper delivery that came in. By the time the people at the back of the queue got to the front, the shop was out because everyone was buying for everyone they knew. When something came into the store and there was nothing in the store, what do? You buy it all because you don't know when it's going to be back.
Exactly.
So you're talking about a massive consumer goods shortage. Other than the people who got paid in foreign currency, because they could go to foreign currency stores, which had all the nice, lovely consumer goods. You're talking washing machines, chocolate, various other types of candy, meat. That was a rarity. Most people only ate meat because they had cared for it and killed it themselves. Most people had to grow their own food. And look after their own food. That is not something most people in the West say they have to do. So in these foreign exchange stores, you could get anything with dollars. And when my family went out over there to see our relatives, they were considered rich because they could go into a foreign exchange store, buy anything they wanted. And my nan, when they used to go to Bydgoszcz in the north of Poland, would typically go into, it was called a PEDEX store. Not to be confused with FedEx, PEDEX with a P, and would buy virtually all of the candy in the store for dollars, and go out in the square in Bydgoszcz and hand out the candy to kids because they never had chocolate in their lives, and if they did, it was very unlikely they had more than a bar in their entire life. So, you know, it was a pretty big deal to be able to buy that stuff. Anyway, I digress. People in Ukraine, same as everywhere else in the communist system, didn't have a lot. So when communism leaves and Ukraine becomes an independent state, there's a lot of hope.
So,
You know,
as a question for you, there's a lot of contested knowledge over in the West side, and even for me, from what I understood, Ukraine became sovereign after World War II. How long after World War II was that? Because everything that I've read here, unless you go digging for very old books in like public libraries and shit like that,
yeah.
you can't find it. It's not taught in schools, nothing.
Okay. It's a really good question. So Ukraine was a part of the USSR. And the USSR in English is the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, right? So Ukraine is was one of the many republics under the Soviet Union. There's a difference between a member of the USSR and a member of the communist bloc. For instance, Poland was part of the Warsaw Pact. They were a communist country, not by choice, arguably, but they were not part of the USSR. Ukraine was a member of the USSR. They got their independence, or they left the Union. Think of it like the Americans, right? Technically, or Texas is a really good example of this, right? Texas was its own country. They were a republic. They decided to join the Union, right? They still have a lot of rights, but they look up to the US federal system, right? Kind of similar system in the USSR. So you have Ukraine, who is a republic of the USSR. They have their own government, but they also answer to the committee, the Central Bureau, the Communist Bureau in the Kremlin in Moscow. They answer to. Officially, they became a independent state from the USSR in 1991. They were still a country during the Cold War, right? But officially, they became an independent state. Pardon me, sorry, in 1991. If that answers your question.
That does.
It's a bit of a confusing answer, but I've tried to do that as best I can.
Oh yeah, no, I mean that's a better answer than most, and I think it's good having that knowledge from people who've actually hunted it down and spent time researching this, because there is so much unknown and so much untold wise that
Yeah.
it's an interesting to see.
I will say this. Obviously, I've spent a lot of time looking at both from a family perspective and an academic perspective at the USSR and the communist bloc. A lot of resources that would help people that are more in depth, unfortunately, just aren't very accessible due to the fact that they're written in another language. So a lot of the documents that I was coming across for my research on certain papers, for instance, on Belarus, a lot of the stuff that was coming across there, while the titles may have been in English, the content was either in Russian or some other language, Eastern European language that I just simply couldn't understand. I had to get translated. So it can be quite difficult to break down. Thankfully, there are now a lot of good resources, especially on Ukraine, because interest has understandably rapidly increased over the past year. So it is becoming easier to understand the history. But even then, you're still having to dig for it. I was just lucky that I could do that in an academic way. But one of the things that I always say to people is, if you're looking for places to, obviously there's loads of good places to understand the war right now. You can go look at, I recommend the ISW, which is a British resource, the Institute for the Study of War. They always put out good pieces on what's going on, and they also have a map. The live UA map as well is really good for understanding the what's going on in the conflict. There's some really good YouTubers out there who have explained parts of the part of the historical context of the war, and keep up to date. Personally, there are two that I listen to, one Ukrainian, one American. The American that I listen to is a guy called Preston Stewart. I believe he used to be in the US Army, and he has a very neutral breakdown of a lot of the events. The other one that I listen to is a guy called Denis Davidov, who is originally from Sevastopol, which is in Crimea, and he was a pilot in Ukraine, a commercial pilot, and he does updates, and he's talked frequently about the history of Ukraine. But if you want to learn more about Ukraine, historically, there's a lot of good resources out there. The easiest thing to say, go to the Wikipedia page. Everyone says that Wikipedia is not an academic source, it's not accurate. I disagree. From an academic point of view, Wikipedia, and it's going to annoy so many people, and I love it, Wikipedia was a really good starting place for research. Just make sure you take the themes that you found, put them into Google, find an academic source for them, find a different source to validate what you're saying. Don't read Wikipedia as gospel. It's a great source, just don't use it entirely. In terms of news, always recommend the BBC. Respectfully, if you're watching Fox or CNN to get your coverage of the war, don't do that. Please do not watch Fox or CNN to get anything accurate. I know that's going to annoy both peoples on both sides. But US media is not a great source. It's a great source for entertainment, not a great source of information.
Oh, it's certainly a
BBC.
great source of entertainment. Jesus.
Well, one of my favorite pastimes in the US is watching Tucker Carlson. Not
Oh
because
my
I necessarily
God.
agree with it, but because as a Brit, that is the funniest thing. It's so enjoyable.
I wish I had my camera rolling because as soon as you started talking about the U.S. media and Wikipedia and shit like that, the grin on my face is ear to ear, man. Because you are right. It's gonna piss off so many people,
Oh yeah,
and quite honestly, I would not be surprised if there is a comment or two about Wikipedia or CNN, Fox is the gospel, yada. And if that's the way that people are, then that's the way that people are, and there's no changing them from that. But it is the uh it is their decision, and people who
I've always
want
said if you piss both sides off, you're doing something right.
exactly, yes. Yeah,
But
my favorite argument about transgender and gun policy is I don't give a fuck. I would rather have my gay friend kissing his boyfriend holding a shotgun while growing his own weed. So,
a true libertarian.
exactly. Well, I'm libertarian with a side of anarchist, but that's a different story for later. So, uh anyways, continuing on.
Yeah, so actually, you know what? That segues pretty nicely into how the people of Ukraine are living now. Actually, I don't know how that's happened, but that's quite funny. Um, so now, obviously, the conflict is still going on. It's it's pretty harsh. From a military perspective, it's not a fun time. Really not a fun time for either side. Um, Come May, it's going to get a hell of a lot worse for the Russians than it is for the Ukrainians. The Ukrainians will have, first off, refitted all of the Russian equipment they got from Kharkiv region, which they got when they did the counteroffensive in Kharkiv. They captured more equipment than they started off the war with. The Russians were initially preparing for an offensive up there to create a large cauldron in the east, push towards the Dnieper River, and hopefully cut off a lot of Ukrainian troops. When the Ukrainians started publicizing very actively that they were going to attack Kherson, the Russians decided to move troops from Kharkiv down to Kherson, about 35,000 troops, and their best troops. They were still setting up for a counterattack when they moved down. So there was a lot of equipment left in the north. The Ukrainians captured all that equipment, and they have been refitting and maintaining and servicing it. The bulk of that will be done by May. That also coincides by when the bulk of the latest promises from the West will arrive in terms of Leopard tanks, Challenger tanks. There's the potential of some Abrams, although that's still up in the air on when those will arrive. But more significantly than the equipment is we've had about 60,000 Ukrainian personnel training in the West in NATO countries. They will be finished training by May. They will be returning back to Ukraine. They will arguably be the most skilled soldiers on the battlefield. And they will have a hell of an impact, not just with their new fancy toys, but also all of the toys that they collected from the box from Russia. They're going to have an interesting time, and we're really going to see a shift in the fighting. It's not just Ukraine who's getting new things, it's Russia too. By May, that second wave of mobilization will have finished training. You're talking, probably talking about 500,000 guys that are going to be in the field by that point. Don't get me wrong, they will be poorly trained, poorly equipped, with super low morale and with awful leadership. But do you know what we call those types of soldiers?
Cannon fodder?
Russian.
Fair.
This is always how Russia's fought. They throw bodies at the problem until it's solved. Usually it works out. Worked out in World War II pretty nicely. World War One didn't work out. We saw a change in government. Afghanistan didn't work out. We saw a change in government. So it could go either way. They'll either fix all the problems with a lot of bodies, which is probably not going to happen because the Ukrainian army has not only been receiving obviously Western aid and training, but this has been going on since 2014. We have been training and supplying them since 2014. It is a completely different military than, 7 years ago? Completely different. They are so much better trained, better equipped, better led than the Russians. It's incredible the transformation they've gone through. They've gone from the Soviet style of military to the Western NATO style of military in 7 years. That is a impressive feat, and they are really showing how far they've come. To obviously show, we've been the javelins that were instrumental in stopping the Russian advance last year. Those have been flying into the country that whole time. Same with the NLAW systems from Britain and Sweden. They're a more cost-effective version of the javelin. Those have been coming in for years. And on the note of the javelin, this has now become a artillery war and a logistics war. Most Russian equipment is moved by rail. They can also use trucks to do that, obviously. The Russians started with 3,000 trucks at the beginning of the war. They have lost 2,300 trucks during the course of a year. So there are 700 trucks left from what they originally have. They have been to move equipment. It is not a large amount. So they really don't have a great logistics system right now. To put it mildly, they have to take civilian stuff. Obviously, that's not very effective for moving around artillery pieces and ammunition. And when things move a lot, they explode. And so Russian logistics is not only decreasing from enemy fire, but it's also decreasing from improper handling. You're seeing explosions all across southern Ukraine, behind the Russian lines, from where they're packing ammunition, artillery shells, into the back of vehicles, which, by the way, these artillery shells have been maintained extremely poorly for the last 50 years, and are very volatile, and now you're putting them in a back of a white van that hasn't had its suspension changed in about 30 years. It's pretty bouncy. Not great for artillery shells.
Yeah, no kidding. One wrong bump and everything goes boom.
Exactly. So they're running short on logistics. Their rail networks are getting constantly blown up. Obviously, Kerch Bridge was hit a couple months back. That knocked the rail system offline for a bit, and it also didn't help the road system, which was basically supplying the entire Russian army in southwest Ukraine. So that was pretty hit pretty hard. Then you've got the issue as well, where they're running out of ammunition anyway. We always hear that they're running out of ammunition. I feel like it's almost every other week on the news where you'll hear that the Russians are almost out of missiles, or they're almost out of artillery shells. They will get more. But the big difference is not whether they have a national stockpile deficit of weapons. It's more localized, and they're having real issues. I mean, in Bakhmut, I believe it was yesterday, the Ukrainians hit a massive ammo dump just off the front lines in Bakhmut, and as a result, we've seen a massive reduction, not just in the amount of things that are being fired, but also just in the general movement of Russian troops, because you can't move forwards against an enemy position if you've got nothing to shoot at them.
Right.
So they're struggling.
Here's your one magazine of 30 bullets. Make every single one count.
That is literally what they're being told. They
Oh
are being
my
told to
God.
make every bullet count. Obviously, that's not great. People forget that in war, it's not necessarily about hitting the enemy. It's about keeping their heads down long enough so you can push up. And right now, that's something that Russia's not able to do very well. They've spent a lot of time firing their artillery shells, so they're running low on artillery. They're running low on barrels for their artillery pieces because they've fired so much through them. The Russian doctrine is, if you see an area where there's buildings, either all the civilians have left because they don't want to fight, or the people that are there, they're happy to stand with Ukraine. They're happy to fight with Ukraine, and we're happy to level those buildings. So the Russians are basically shelling everything that stands. There are some cities where there is not a building left standing. I would have a feeling, if have a look at pictures of Bakhmut, it's probably a similar case where there are very few buildings still with four walls and a roof. I doubt it's very likely. Fortunately, that makes it very difficult to push into into an area, as the Germans found out in Stalingrad and the Allies found out at Monte Cassino. When you destroy something to rubble, it makes it very easy to hide in and ambush people. And that's why
Yes.
the Russians are now going around the flanks. Unfortunately, that's slowed because the Russians' main source of pushing around things is going through fields, and the fields right now you're talking about 1.5 feet of mud, maybe more. In some places you're looking at 4 feet plus of mud. It is a quagmire, and you cannot move armored vehicles through that. It has been abnormally warm this winter in Europe as a whole. I mean, to give you a reference, we're at the beginning of March right now, and right here it is 43 degrees. We're at the beginning of March. It's been about 36 to 40 degrees for the past month.
Mind you,
That create
that is all in Fahrenheit for the American viewers. What would that be in Celsius? I
you're
can't do that
looking
conversion.
you're looking at about 7 degrees Celsius.
Okay.
So it's not cold enough to freeze, but it's also just about the right temperature to create a shitload of mud.
Yes.
And we've obviously had a decent amount of rain. Now, those fields have had vehicles going over them for a year in Ukraine now. That's completely churned up. You are fill a lake with mud, basically, is what I'm saying these fields are like. They are deep, they are thick, and it is basically soup. It is just mud soup. So the Russians are struggling to push. Moving from the military to the civilian side, the big thing that Russia has been doing is shelling or firing missiles at all of the infrastructure in Ukraine, not just the military infrastructure, but also the civilian infrastructure. They have periodically been taking down the electrical infrastructure. They are also aiming at basically destroying any piece of agricultural infrastructure. So Ukraine will really struggle to regain its status as the breadbasket of Europe after the war. Combine that with the fact that I think I touched on this on Sunday actually with everyone. The Russians have been laying mines in fields all over Ukraine, predominantly farmers' fields. We will see farmers being blown up by mines probably for the next 10 years in Ukraine. So, yeah, it's going to take a heavy toll on them. Obviously, civilians not having any electricity means that, thankfully, they've had a bit of a warmer winter. But Ukraine gets cold. It's been difficult to stay warm. Water supplies, there's no electricity, so the pumps don't work. So getting water to your house is not an easy task either if you've got no electricity. So they've had issues there. I mean, anything from taking a shower to cooking food has been almost impossible. Most people, I saw a photo actually, guy driving around Kiev in a Tesla had a generator hooked to the back of it.
Of course he did.
Because there's no electricity half the time. There's constant blackouts. It's getting better. Obviously, the West has been supplying Ukraine with air defenses now for again the past year. We're just sending them now NASAMS and Patriot missile batteries. They're shooting down a pretty hefty chunk of whatever enters their airspace, so it is getting better and easier. But overall, it's not great for them. A lot of civilian refugees have come into Europe. To give you a personal anecdote, my cousin put up a Ukrainian refugee family in his flat in Germany for, I want to say 3-4 months, and helped them get refugee status in the country. My boss has a Ukrainian family in his home right now. I forget the last details, but it was a good few million people that have left the Ukraine to come to Europe. So, and the ones that are still there are fighting pretty hard to survive. Sorry, excuse me.
I don't know what this mute is for, but I will give it a minute.
Sorry, I'm back. I just had someone call me to clarify something.
No, you're good. So I guess the last 2 questions for you.
Yep.
Regarding the influx of people from all over during the beginning of this war, is Ukraine still accepting help from outside people? Because I know for a while they had like a come at your own discretion style draft going on. And there were Americans and Europeans from all over that were literally arming themselves and going over to Ukraine and just helping the Ukrainians push back the Russians as they came in. What is their stance on that now? And what do they still want help? Are they still accepting people? What exactly is going on with that?
So it's important to note that the Ukrainians were asking for, not actively asking for help, but they were saying, if you want to come help, help. The caveat for that is they didn't just want anyone to come help. They don't want the burden of people coming in and from nothing and training. They accepted these people, but they weren't what they wanted. They primarily wanted people that were going to be useful to them. You're talking experienced, right? Not just necessarily militarily experienced, but also anyone who's worked in the medical field or infrastructure field, stuff like that, right? Because they realized that they were going to have to obviously treat people and also build up their country. But they accepted pretty much anyone that came in and gave them training, and they still do to the most part accept people that come in. It's less important. They've gone through their drafts. They've recruited a hell of a lot of people. Manpower really isn't their biggest issue right now. Obviously, if people want to go fight over there, they're still more than welcome. The Ukrainians will still let them in, and they do have foreign volunteer battalions, which is extremely helpful, obviously, because I'm assuming not a lot of people speak Ukrainian or Russian, which is the two primary languages in Ukraine. There have been all types of people that have gone there. A lot of Brits, a lot of Americans, as I'm sure you know. There were Finnish Jaegers who went there, which is an interesting story if you've not heard about that one, where they weren't officially sanctioned, but they were taken off of Finland's pay books and went over there to help fight.
Fucking, oh my God. So, like, full, I don't want to say black ops because that's so overused, but just, hey, we need you to do this and you'll be paid when you come back.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Right now they're getting paid by the Ukrainians, and they will be paid when they get back as well. Is the talk that I'm hearing? They're only really known about because one of the guys has a YouTube channel and posts a lot of content on there about it. But yeah, there's loads of Brits over there right now. A good few have actually died over there. So foreign volunteers or anyone who's thinking of going, it's not like they're keeping you safe back for PR purposes. You are in that fight with them,
Oh,
and
yeah.
they appreciate that help, but you're fighting. There's been cases of people going over there thinking, oh, I'm going to go help, who have never seen that type of thing before, getting all their kit, being put into a pretty basic infantry unit, and realizing, oh fuck, I'm having to fight what at that time was a pretty mechanized Russian army. And that's not very fun if you've never been in front of that type of thing before. It is a proper peer-to-peer war, and a lot of people didn't like that and skipped on home. Thought, fuck this. But there's a lot of pretty key influential British figures over there right now. For instance, the son of an MP is over there fighting. A
Nice.
member of
Okay.
parliament.
So this reminds me a lot of our Sunday operation, which follows this, of where we're sitting at that machine gun bunker, and it was true peer to peer of I
Oh
hear a
yeah.
tank, and then suddenly a fucking BMP pops over, and you're like, oh, that's a legitimate threat, and I don't have the AT to take care of this.
Nope. And that's a pretty common occurrence.
Ah, Jesus. So, and then the last thing, and you touched on this a little bit on Sunday as well when we did our op. Um,
Yeah.
you were saying that at the beginning of this, a lot of the Ukrainians were not trained in tactics or in weaponry systems, and so they were like fucking watching YouTube videos on their way to the front line, learning how to
Mhm.
do this shit. It, I don't know if you were being facetious. Can't
No,
fucking say that word.
it's true.
Jesus. So,
Yeah. So they had, for instance, in Kiev. I'm pretty sure this is a real figure. It sounds like a joke figure, but I think it's real. They had a 1-to-1. This is what's been said. You can verify it yourself. But allegedly, they had a 1-to-1 civilian to javelin ratio in Kiev,
oh my God.
which is insane. First off, that's fucking ludicrous. But obviously, the javelins. Yeah, it's both a pretty complex system and a pretty simple system if you know how to use it. And yeah, so they were literally just watching YouTube videos on how to use it. And you can go onto YouTube and actually find a bunch of the defense manufacturing companies released videos on how to use their equipment as a result of what was happening in Ukraine, because they realized, like, we can't teach these guys fast enough to use this equipment because we're not there. And typically speaking, you're talking at least a couple weeks to be fully qualified, not necessarily trained, but qualified to use this equipment. And they're desperate. They don't have this time, right? So there was a lot of videos that were put out either by the Ukrainian Ministry of Defense or by the defense manufacturers on a really quick, like 5 to 10 minute guide on how to use these weapon systems. Good fucking luck.
Wow.
They were desperate, and you know what? In the end, it worked, and now obviously they're in a position where, for the most part, the front lines are pretty stable. This is the good thing about it having been a lot warmer. I'm not a big climate change fan personally. People have different views on it. Personally, I believe in it, and the whole climate change thing. But what this global warming climate change has really helped out with is Ukraine being able to keep front lines stable because of the mud. So they've had loads of time now to train on these pieces of equipment, whether it is through legitimate training or just through battlefield knowledge, where they've had to do it in such an intense short period of time that it's just been ingrained into their muscle memory through that trial by fire type thing.
Yeah, under heavy stress, being like, okay, flick this switch, open this cover, point at enemy, fucking pull trigger.
Pretty much.
Yeah.
Thankfully, a lot of these Western systems are not that challenging to use. We've not seen the levels of ineptitude that we would expect from someone doing that. For instance, stories of people in Afghanistan and Iraq, specifically, I've heard stories about the ANA who would, and I don't know whether it's just because they were incompetent or absolutely jacked up on heroin out of their minds, where they would accidentally leave the percussion caps on the end of an RPG, which means that the RPG, when it impacted, wouldn't explode. We've not seen that level of ineptitude from the Ukrainians. They have learnt pretty quickly how to use basically all of the weapon systems extremely effectively.
Well, I mean, we do have to design it for our Marines, and the Crayon Eaters don't necessarily take the time to do things simply. So big handles, shit that rips apart.
As a member of the Coast Guard, I'll let you rattle on them as much as you want.
Exactly. I'm allowed to rattle on them a little bit. I'm sure I'll receive some hate mail for it, but I don't care. They can call me a fucking puddle pirate all they want.
Actually, that brings me on to a really good point, is how they've actually been using this Western equipment. I'm not sure how conscious of time you are, but I'll try and get through this pretty quick. We've seen systems like, for instance, the big one at the beginning of the war was the HIMARS system, right? That HIMARS system was brought to Ukraine pretty early on, all things considered. To me, it feels like the first big major piece of equipment they got during this conflict. I would say the precursor to what they got in terms of really good equipment. Before HIMARS, the one to note would be Javelin and Henlaw, right? So they've slowly been progressing up through the stages. In my opinion, HIMARS is like stage 2 equipment, I would call it, of what they've got since the whole thing started in 2014. HIMARS, they have deployed and used it in such an effective way. They have been using it. Obviously, they've only got a couple of units of this. They're getting more, but they've not got many units and they've not got many rockets. But the way in which they're using these pieces of equipment is so effective. They're relying on both their own intelligence and also US intelligence for the most part. The US is feeding them a lot of intel, whether it's through satellite imagery or the AWACS aircraft they've got constantly up over the Black Sea in Eastern Europe. filtering what's coming through and their airspace. But the Ukrainians have been using all the intelligence that they've gotten to pinpointly strike ammunition dumps and troop buildups to the point where Russia now is really trying to hide a lot of this stuff unsuccessfully. Told you, I think it was yesterday, or maybe the day before that they just hit another ammunition dump in Bakhmut, to the east of Bakhmut. It was a couple months ago. They hit a building in, I believe it was in Donetsk, with a HIMARS battery. It leveled an entire college building that was holding about 600 Russian troops. That's a pretty big deal. The thought is that they were conscripts, but that's still a lot of pieces you've just eliminated from the board. And they're also doing a lot of surgical deep strikes, whether that was the Kerch Bridge strike. We still don't know how they've hit that, but clearly they have, whether that was through some insane special forces operation, striking that bridge with explosives, or whether they somehow were able to either put a 1980s Soviet drone onto that bridge, or whether they had ATACMS missiles for the HIMARS that the US didn't publicly declare that they had sent, that they hit with. But whatever it is, they've been using the HIMARS extremely effectively to knock out a lot of Russian logistics depots. At the beginning of the war, again, one of the first pieces of equipment they received was a Caesar battery. The Caesar is a French artillery piece, basically mounted on a truck. And the Ukrainians lost Snake Island, and they were determined to take it back. And they did. And for the longest time, no one could figure out how they hit Snake Island and were able to take it back. Turns out that this Caesar battery didn't have the range to hit Snake Island from mainland Ukraine. So they put it on a barge and pushed the barge out to sea till it got in range of Snake Island, and started shelling Snake Island from a French artillery piece on a barge. So not only are they using equipment very effectively, but they have the initiative and the ingenuity to hit basically whatever they want, whenever they want.
That sounds like some fucking marine bullshit right there, of just, it floats and it has a gun, and we don't have a big enough boat or a long enough range to get there. So fuck it, we're going to make this work. That is,
and they made it work pretty well.
and that is ingenuity of, like, oh my god. I did
Yeah.
not know about this, so I appreciate you sharing me that story, because that is fucking amazing. I love that.
The Americans couldn't figure out because obviously they had the satellite imagery of Snake Island being just shelled the crap out of.
Right.
And they could not figure out how the Ukrainians were doing it. And one day the Ukrainians were like, okay, fine, like a Penn and Teller trick, right? They were like, oh, we'll show you how we did this trick. And told the Americans. And they told the Americans, and the Americans were like, what the fuck?
Oh my god. Oh god. Coming from somebody who's watched seasons of fucking Penn and Teller, that is the best quote you could have possibly used. That is amazing.
But yeah, I mean, they're doing such like amazing work out there with what they've been given. And they just, unlike the Russians who have equipment and no idea how to use it in a modern war, the Ukrainians have just been able to time and time again show that they are an effective fighting force and that they know what they're doing. Yeah, it's why I'm not too worried right now about a lot of people are. You get both sides of the spectrum. A lot of people are saying, "Oh, the Ukrainians are getting absolutely slaughtered in Bakhmut. They're stupid for holding on to it. They should retreat." And you get the other side who think that the Ukrainians can do no wrong. To an extent, I think the Ukrainians are pretty competent. I mean, they've had a year of pretty good fighting to learn from. Um, I think they have a very effective fighting force, and the leadership knows exactly what they're doing. It again, I've said it just a moment ago. I'll say it again. The US is feeding so much intelligence to the Ukrainians. It's ridiculous. If you pull up a flight tracker, the chances of you seeing an unlisted flight over the Black Sea coming from a Western nation is pretty likely, or if not over the Black Sea, flying up and down across Poland, you'll more than likely see something. That's all that information is being fed not just to the US, but directly to the Ukrainians, who have created what is just an insane command and control center in Kiev. And that's also then filtered down through the chain of command so amazingly. They have live footage of almost live satellite feed of almost everything that's going on in Ukraine. It is basically like the generals in Ukraine are playing a game of Hearts of Iron. That's how accurate it is to what they can see on the front lines. They, in real time, generals now in Ukraine can tell individual squads where they need to be, if they so please. Clearly, or obviously they don't. Obviously, those orders get relayed pretty nicely down through the chain of command, and it's not micromanaging, but the generals have such a good idea of what's going on the ground from the top. We've never seen anything of this scale. Just the information gathering capability that the West has given Ukraine is mind-boggling. Obviously we can see live frontline updates on the map anyway. That is, you go back even a couple of years ago, there were live maps of what was happening in Syria. The difference between those and this is just astronomical. Just to touch on those maps, they're not entirely up to date. The Ukrainians, obviously, in real time can see where everything is. That information is clearly not publicly available. So any information that comes through is it can be a little spotty. Really got to do your research to see how accurate information is. There have been numerous times in this war where people have said, "Oh, the Ukrainians have encircled this Russian unit in this area." In fact, last week there was something about Ukrainians encircling Russians just north of Bakhmut. We can't validate that. I would go as far to say, don't believe things just because you've read them. Wait a couple of days, see what happens. Everyone wants live updates. They want to get hyped, or they want to, have a bit of a cry over what's happening in Ukraine. Don't take everything as gospel. It takes at least 2-3 days to get accurate, semi-accurate reports. You're waiting for months even to get the full picture on how they've done things, what actually transpired. It's more information than we've usually got. For instance, the US in Iraq and Afghanistan, we could get information, but often that was patchy. We're getting a lot more information now. We're getting a fuller picture, but it is not the full picture. Said that the Ukrainians know exactly what's going on, and it is a very good idea that they have decided not to constantly share that with everyone.
Right. No, and that's OPSEC at its best there.
Yeah. that is the one thing that the Ukrainians are very good at, is their OPSEC. The Russians, on the other hand, have been notoriously poor at that throughout the entire war. Members of the military will know about things with mobile phones. The Russians often disregard their phone laws, or their phone rules, should I say, and will very happily take mobile phones with SIM cards in, with their cellular service on, into Ukraine to the front lines. And this is one of the ways that Ukraine has been able to pinpoint troop build-ups and ammunition depots
Look for
is
the
by,
area. Look for the area
yeah,
with the large use of cellular usage. Jesus.
yeah. And it
That
also
is.
doesn't help that at the beginning of the war, the Russians were buying Ukrainian SIM cards
Of
for
course they
use in
were.
Ukraine. So
Uh,
they also, this is how we've got them, and a lot of people will have heard these, and if you haven't, I really suggest going to listen to them, because it gives you a really good idea about what the thoughts of the soldiers on the Russian side, what they are. But we can hear every single Russian phone conversation. Whether that's because they're going through unencrypted phone lines, or because they're using Ukrainian SIM cards. And it is giving the Ukrainians such a large information edge, it's unreal. I mean, the amount of things that's been said on these phone calls that the Ukrainians have had as actionable intel is just ridiculous.
wow. That
As I said,
is.
this war is an information war, and unfortunately, the Russians aren't very good at keeping that information to themselves.
Yeah, this is information war mixed with a percentage of fighting and logistics.
Yeah, pretty much. I mean, you know, the benefit of an individual soldier has been rapidly declining, for the past 200 years. This is one of those conflicts where it is not necessarily about manpower, it is about precision. Precision artillery, precision airstrikes. It is about logistics, and it is about information. Those are the three things that are going to win this conflict. Especially now that Ukraine has very precise targeting systems, it has basically rendered a lot of Russian hard positions useless. I mean, we've all seen the videos of drones hovering over Russian trenches and just dropping grenades in. Even what is historically been a very safe defensive fortification, a trench, even that now is pretty vulnerable,
We've literally
more so
turned
than ever.
this. We've literally turned this into Terminator with 8-blade drones.
Yeah, well, I mean, we've had the first drone-on-drone combat in Ukraine.
That's true. That's
Uh,
true.
not that it was. I mean, it was. It was interesting to watch. It was pretty difficult to watch. I mean, it's basically two drones jousting.
Well,
But it was, it's the same as the development of aircraft. Where you get drones in World War One. You had planes going past each other and the pilots would wave, and then eventually they started putting fingers up at each other, and eventually that pissed off the pilots enough to shoot pistols at each other, and then they installed machine guns on their planes. We'll have the exact same things with drones in Ukraine,
yeah.
where the drones now will, we already have armed drones. We've had armed drones for quite a number of years. I remember when I was a kid watching a FPS Russia video. If you remember him.
I do remember him.
Yeah, that's an interesting story for another time. But he got one of the Black Ops, was it Black Ops 2 drones? The flying drones with the gun on it. He got a real life version of that when the game came out. And I remember watching that video and being like, wow, that's pretty impressive.
Of course he spent money and built something like that.
Oh yeah, like it was FPS Russia. I mean, how could he not? Um, but now that's going to be something we'll see in Ukraine. Probably not anytime soon. There's really not much of a need for that right now, I would say.
Oh, don't say
Um,
those words. That's a great way to end up in the next 2 months with fucking flying dragon drones from Modern Warfare 2.
oh God, I hope not, please.
Fucking comes
But
through the door and it's just a minigun attached to a quadcopter.
you know what? I kind of, for the Ukrainians, I hope that's a possibility now, because that would, they won't even need anyone on the front lines. They could just whiz around the back, like it's one of these drone racing videos with a machine gun attached on it.
Oh my
And do
god. Doing crazy fucking acrobatics tricks, lines up a shot. Just small
we're gonna
bursts.
get Call of Duty drone montages now in real life. Jesus, God. I
Uh,
think that actually segues pretty nicely on to what the end of this war is going to look like, though. Um, June, July is, I think, when we'll see how this war is going to shape out. That's when the majority of the equipment will have arrived from the west. That's really going to help this fight. And obviously those trained troops we talked about as well. It's when the Russian mobilized troops are going to start arriving en masse. We're really going to see whether Russia either wins this war or there's a change in government. Those are the only two real outcomes I see here personally. We've already yesterday seen the Russian units of the Ukrainian army went back into Russia yesterday, and then they came back to Ukraine again. To clarify, this is Russians who completely disagree with Putin's Russia and have decided to fight for Ukraine. Went into Russia. They killed a border guard on the way in, allegedly. That's the story that's come out right now. Didn't do anything as far as we know in Ukraine. In Russia. But we're already seeing some active resistance starting to spike up. In terms of Russians, we'll have to see whether this is a case of Russia either winning this war or losing and having a change in government. Those have historically been the only two paths. I doubt Putin will sue for peace.
fair enough.
On that note, I hope this has been informative. You have basically grabbed every bit of information, bar a couple of things that I have, and I unfortunately have to depart. But I hope this was informative. I hope this was helpful, and thank you for listening to me talk for an hour and a half.
I appreciate it, man. And like I said, my biggest thing is I want to show the other side of shit because I know that there's a certain level that we're not getting, and that is the other side and how it's being affected, and the people around the country, the people in country, so on. And
Yeah,
the information and the stories that you've gotten to share with me, I hope that anybody who listens to this is able to listen to it, enjoy it, hear the other side of things, and make their own decision on how it is, because that's like my biggest piece, right?
yeah.
So
That's important that people sort of. I don't want anyone to take the words that I've said as gospel. Please do your own research. Um, I may have said something wrong. I am only human. Please, if there's something that interests you that I've said, go research it, have a deeper dive into it, learn more about what's going on. One thing that we didn't touch upon, which unfortunately I just don't have the time right now to do, is also the general feelings in Russia. There's a really good YouTube channel called 1420 that goes into that as well. But yeah, please do your own research. Have a look into things that interest you. on the conflict, have a look at some of the history. Hopefully I've been helpful in giving some tools to be able to do that, other than just look at Wikipedia.
Right.
But this is something I feel quite passionately about, in studying and learning about, and hopefully that's been transmitted. I try to do it in a way that is as look. I'm from England. I have family in Poland who lived under communism. Naturally, I'm going to be not pro-Russia, but hopefully the information that I've given across has been in a pretty unbiased way. That's what I've liked to think I've done.
And quite honestly, I agree with that. I think that it's been very unbiased because I feel like you're playing both sides of the fence in both of it. And I think that that's well put in doing that.
Yeah, it allows people to form their own opinions, and that's really important. I understand. I have a lot of American friends, for instance, who are not pro-Ukraine and actually a bit more pro-Russian. And it's just, regardless of what side of this fight you're on, I don't mind. It's just as long as you're educated enough to define your position and back it up. That's the important thing. You are allowed to believe whatever you want, as long as you can back it up with empirical facts and evidence.
Yes,
Um, I,
always.
I, I am not a wizard. I can't say how this fight is going to go. I can just say how it's gone and form my own opinions from there. And I hope other people can do the same.
Always, man. Cool.
Perfect.
Well, Fisher, I
Good.
appreciate you very much. You have an abundance of knowledge, and I hope that we get to do this again about either Ukraine or whatever ends up coming up next. And quite honestly, with the with the Arma group that we're in, with so many of you guys being across on the other side of the world, the information that we have, we can relay to you and vice versa. And if you guys ever want stuff from us talking about the US, which God, we are horrible about OPSEC. Oh, we had this another mass shooting. Jesus, can we shut up? The whole world doesn't need to know that we had 3 more schools go up in flames. It's fine. So, so if you guys ever want to do stuff like that with me or vice versa, you guys are always welcome to.
Garland podcast time. Let's go.
Right? That might become a thing. TFL podcast time. Oh, that's awesome. All right,
Your
Fisher.
host with the most Garland.
Oh no. Now that's gonna be a comment someplace. Oh Christ.
Alrighty, Garland. Thank you so much. I hope everyone's enjoyed this little informative piece. And if anyone wants to reach out ever on anything, please feel free, and I'll do my best to give an answer. This was great. Let's do it again sometime.
Yeah, definitely. All right, boss.
Perfect.
I will see
See you
you
later.
at a later date and enjoy the rest of your day.
You too. Thank you, man.
Of course.